Hello and welcome back to Unravelling. In this video, we are exploring a Christian perspective on gender. In our last video, we spent our time looking at what our culture has to say about gender. But tonight, we really want to spend our time looking at what a Christian worldview has to say on the topic. Last time we were together, Tim, you really emphasised to us that part 3 of Unravelling comes in 3 videos. And they come together as a package, don't they?
Yeah, each one in isolation will feel a bit unbalanced, yeah.
Yes, because the issue of gender, it is an issue of culture and of worldviews. But for us as Christians, we really want to know what the Bible says on the topic, because this is something that affects our lives. It affects the ways in which we live.
Yeah.
But we really wanted to point out, like we did last time, that this isn't just a debate. It is about people's lives, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And as we said last time, the hard thing is you can't talk about it all at once. So although in this video we'll be spending most of our time talking about theology, kind of Christian ideas, what the Bible has to say, we might still be saying, yes, but what about the impact on people? And what we'd say, well, that in the third video, hopefully we'll have more time to spend on those. So taken as a whole, the 3 videos should provide us with some balance. We'll try and cover as much as we can and just be patient with us, really. If it takes us a while to get to the things that those of you who are watching really want us to talk about.
Okay. So tonight it's all about a Christian worldview on gender, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And that's why part 2 of Unravelling matters, because back then we looked at a Christian epistemology, which is to do with knowing. So how do we as Christians come to know the truth about anything? And if you remember back then, we looked at this Christian worldview and said that in a Christian worldview, there is a truth that resides in God rather than in us, so it's objective. And this means that we can come to know the truth, but we can't make the truth.
Yeah.
And that's in contrast to the stories of our culture that we explored in part 1 of Unravelling, where for our culture, we as humans create what is true. But as Christians, we don't believe that. We believe we can come to know the truth. And the ways we do that are through general revelation and special revelation. So by general revelation, we were talking about our experience, our reason, how you and I make sense of the world in the normal day-to-day kind of life that we live. And then by special revelation, we're talking particularly about what God reveals through the Bible and in Christian tradition, the experience of God's people throughout all the centuries. So it might be helpful to think of the last video we recorded, 3.1, the first one on gender, as really operating in the realm of general revelation. What can we know is true about gender and sex through our experience and the use of our reason, whereas today we're turning particularly to special revelation.
And that special revelation really, it gives us a different starting point to other views in culture, isn't it? We're starting from a different point of view because of our faith.
Yeah.
And I think that's also in like the new approaches that we looked at, the new approaches on gender, but also when we look at the critical pushback, where we start from is a different point, isn't it?
I think that's quite important to recognise, actually, that the new approaches to gender are one expression of the identity story and the power and oppression stories playing out in this particular arena. And we know from part 1 of Unravelling that the foundations of that is atheistic foundation, that there's no God, there's no truth, it's postmodern pluralism, there's no objective truth. But you're right, the critical pushback is actually often from those who hold the same presuppositions they also would hold to the view of a world without God, a postmodern approach to knowledge where there's no absolute truth. And then they might disagree violently about the conclusions and think that their truth is the one that they want to win, but operating within the same basic set of assumptions.
Their foundations are still differ to ours.
Different, exactly. And so when we talk about what has a Christian worldview got to offer that's different, part of the answer, like you say, is, well, we're starting from a very different place. And hopefully we'll see tonight as we go on the implications are vast of that different starting place.
So are we going to be looking at the Bible and theology this evening?
That's the plan. What we're going to try not to do is take a couple of verses from the Bible, rip them out of their context and use them as proof text to say whatever we want to say. That does happen.
Yeah.
That's not what we're going to try and do. We are going to look at some verses from the Bible, but we're really going to try and outline the sort of big picture theology of what the Bible reveals to us about human beings and about how God has created them and how this informs the way that we understand gender. And we'll be doing that with an eye to tradition all the way through. So what has the church believed and taught throughout the centuries about gender?
Great. So where do we start?
So where I want to start is the really important big picture point that for the Christians, gender is something that God has given us as a gift.
Okay.
So in our culture, in a weird way, sex is everything and it's also nothing. So what I mean by that is sex in terms of expressing my sexuality, having sex, sexual fulfillment is really, really, really important in our culture, which we'll talk much more about in part 4 of Unraveling. It's kind of everything.
Yeah.
But the importance of our sexed bodies, the sex that we are as human beings, is not important at all, and particularly in new approaches to gender, as we explored in our last video. So our sex is everything and nothing at the same time.
Yeah.
But for a Christian, because we start with the presupposition that we're here not as random, meaningless, just unfolding of the universe and its physical, chemical outgoings, but we're created deliberately on purpose by God who cares for us and loves us and that sort of thing. And that means that our sexed bodies are something that he's chosen to create.
Okay.
They're a gift from him. And this means that our sex can't be nothing.
It can't not matter.
Because it's something that God's chosen to do deliberately. It must be important. It must be an important part of our identity of who we are. But it also means that we can't reduce our identity just to sex. Sex can't be everything.
Yeah.
Because God has created us as much more than just our sex bodies and sex. So the Christian worldview holds us away from either of those two extremes of our culture. And perhaps it might be helpful to look at a few verses in Genesis that start to express this and unpack them a bit together. So in the first book of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1, you have this theological, poetical account of the creation of the world, including humankind. And in verses 26 and 27, we read, "Then God said, 'Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the wild animals of the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth.'" And then you get these lines of poetry, really. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And although this is a very short part of the Bible, it introduces to us some of the most important things that God is telling us about what it is to be a human that's then reaffirmed as we go through the rest of the Bible. So if you notice, it says that God creates us in his image. This is the thing that fundamentally gives us a value. Mm-hmm. We haven't got time tonight to unpack all that it means to be in the image of God, but this is what gives us value. This is what secures our identity and our worth, is that we're made in the image of God. Male and female, he created them. So both male and female are created in the image of God, and humankind is created as either male or female, or both together, if you like. And so what that tells us is that being human is to be male or female, and both male and female is to be in the image of God. And there's a complementarity here. So male and female, there's a difference between them. There's not just a humankind. Yeah. There's a humankind that is male and female, but there's an equality in the sense that both are in the image of God. There's not a kind of difference in that regard. But there is a difference in that there's not one.
Yeah.
There's not one gender of human. Yeah. There's two here, male and female. So that equal difference, that complementarity, is at the very basis of the foundation of a Christian anthropology, a Christian understanding of what a human is. And if this is true, then our sex bodies are a gift from God that actually gives us a vocation.
Okay.
They give us a task, a shape to the way that we have to live. So you don't have to live your life just as a person.
Yeah.
God has created you as a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And part of your vocation in life is to learn what it means to live as a woman in the image of God, not just as a human in the image of God. And say to you, for me, part of my vocation is to learn how to live as a man in the image of God, not just as a person in the image of God.
So what about intersex?
I think that's a really fair question, because especially after our last video, that's going to be the obvious point, isn't it? But what if it's not as simple as that? And we're going to come back to that a little bit later on tonight. So if we could park that question for the moment, and then if we don't return to it, you can pick me up on it. But the plan is to come back to it next time. If we read the next verse of Genesis, so these are verses 26 and 27 that we've just read through. If we now read the next verse together, Genesis goes on to say that God blessed them. So he made them male and female, in his own image he made them. Then God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." And really then, this is starting to talk about the human task of creating culture, creating society, so filling the air, subduing it, bringing kind of human culture and society to being, which is part of God's commission. But it's interesting that God blesses them after it says that he's created us male and female. And this has given the church through the ages the theology that actually part of our being male and female gives us a vocation, and that vocation is for human flourishing. That this gift of sex, of differentiated sex, is something that's given by God on purpose for our good, and that is a part of what goes into creating culture, creating human society. Part of that, in terms of being fruitful, is to do with sex and childbearing, but we'll come on to that much more in part 4 of Unraveling. For now, we just want to see that this is connected to human flourishing. And so we ask a different question, really, if all this is true. Rather than asking, who do I want to be, which is the identity question of our story, we say, who was I created to be?
Yeah.
And how can I live into that in a way that brings about the human flourishing that God gave me this gift for, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's like, every man and woman has it's their quest to find out what it means to be a man or a woman.
That's right. And it is a discovery. It's a mimesis. It's us aligning ourselves with the truth rather than a poiesis, us making the truth. So I think that's really true. When we do that, of course, that leads to certain consequences that are relevant for the debate around gender that is worth going through. So if all this is true, that our sex bodies are a gift from God and that gives us a particular vocation for human flourishing, we are obviously saying then that we hold men and women to be different, and that difference is important.
Okay.
But as soon as I say that, I want to qualify it.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that we should just be accepting certain stereotypes of what it is to be a woman and what it is to be a man. And actually, as we'll see, it means opposing those stereotypes where they're harmful or just wrong, and being critical of that. And neither is it saying that all men are like this or all women are like this. No, of course, there's vast differences amongst men and women in who they are and what they're like. But with those qualifications, we're still saying that men and women are different and those differences are important. And then this view does reaffirm a gender binary, really, saying that gender is male or female. But again, we also want to qualify that by saying that you remember the bell curves from the last video we did? That means there's often a lot of overlap between men and women in all kinds of ways, and particular individuals might be all over the place. But that doesn't undercut the truth that men and women are different. The other thing that the Christian worldview commits us to then, as well as saying that men and women are different, is to say that men and women are interdependent.
Okay.
God created humankind, male and female, and he blessed them as male and female. Both are necessary then for flourishing in the creation of society. So what the Christian worldview should do is totally oppose any sort of sexism or idolization of our own sex. So any sort of view that, men don't... Exactly. Or we don't need each other. That men don't need women, or women don't... Everything would be better if my gender was in control of this sort of thing. And we have to oppose all of that and say, no, men and women are both given by God for human flourishing, and both are therefore necessary. And we actually see this in the Bible a couple of times. So particularly, I might be thinking about 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul, one of the early church leaders, is trying to sort out a problem in one of his churches around gender roles. And in amongst that, one of the things he's stressing to them is men need women and women need men, and you're not independent, and actually you have to, it's an interdependence.
Going to work together.
Yeah, that's right. And on an individual level, this means that what we're saying is that you need relationships with men, and I need relationships with women, not necessarily romantic or sexual. I'm not talking about that necessarily, but I am incomplete just as myself, and without real relationships with those of the other gender, well, the full image of God won't be revealed.
We sort of lack that flourishing.
We lack the flourishing that we could have because of this. So they're all natural consequences of this belief that gender is something that's given to us by God. I think a nice way to maybe finish that off is to look at a few verses from Genesis 5, which come a little bit later in the book than Genesis 1, where there's a bit of a recap. And it says, when God created humankind, he made them in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them and named them humankind when they were created. And that kind of demonstrates the interdependence and the coming together of male and female in the blessing and the purposes of God. And that's something that I think we then see played out through the rest of the Bible as well, but sort of set in motion by these verses, if that makes some sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. But I wanted to ask, so that seems to be focusing a lot on our sexed bodies, male and female. But what about gender identity? What about the distinctions between sex and gender?
Yeah, that we explored a bit in the last video. So that's probably better as a second point, really. So our sex bodies are a gift from God. Our gender is in part socially constructed, but can't be detached from our sex bodies. That's, I think, the view that a Christian worldview comes to. So on the one hand, we can agree that gender is in part socially constructed. So should men wear long hair or not, that's a social construction of what it means to be male played out in a particular time and place. And that's fine. And because we believe in the ongoing development of human culture over time, through natural revelation, we can be totally in agreement with those who say, often large parts of our gender is socially constructed and we should be relaxed that changes over time in different places. What we can't do is go all the way and say it's totally socially constructed, because God creates us male or female. He doesn't just create our bodies. He creates all of us, our hearts, our minds, our souls, all that it means to be a person, which is more than just the body he creates. And so all of us is created male or female, and therefore our gender can't be totally detached from our sex bodies and therefore can't be socially constructed. But it's important to say, I think, that the Bible really doesn't have a lot to say on this is what it means to be a man and this is what it means to be a woman. There are a few things and a few hints here and there, but the actual explicit stuff on that is really quite limited. And we need to be careful as Christians to not try and make the Bible say more than it does about this. I think most of what we know about gender and male-female differences that we've talked a bit about actually comes through natural revelation,
Right.
not through special revelation. And I want to recognise that, really.
So it seems as though we're saying on the one hand, our bodies are really important.
Yeah.
But on another hand, we're not only our bodies.
Yeah, that's right. We are more than just a body, but we're not less than a body. I think this is the key to understanding why the Christian worldview is so different from culture on the areas of gender and sex. Okay. I think if we can grasp this, it's important this is a gift from God as well, but this is key to why it plays out so differently. For us, a human is a body-soul union where both of those things matter, and it can't be reduced either way.
Okay.
So we can't be a body without a soul.
Yeah.
In kind of Greek philosophical thought, Plato and so on, they said the real person is the soul, and they're sort of trapped in this body.
Yeah.
And they've got to escape this body to be truly free. And this influences Western thought forever.
Yeah.
Up till now. In Judaism and in Christianity, this blossomed in a form of belief called Gnosticism, where again the aim was to escape from your body, to be set free. And actually, we see that all the time in various expressions of spirituality now, don't we?
Yeah.
It's our inner self. We're trapped. We need to escape. We need these outer body experiences. We could talk more about that, but we won't say. But all of that says that a person doesn't need their body.
Yes.
And we can't go there.
That.
We're not saying that. But also, when we're not saying a person is only their body.
Yeah.
And that's the position of materialism, naturalism that we've talked about in earlier parts of Unraveling. There's no supernatural, there's no soul, there's no God, there's just organic matter.
There's just the experience that I have right now.
Yeah, you are your body alone. And in that worldview, then, it can go both ways. It can either go that, therefore, your bodily pleasure and enjoyment is the most important thing, because it's the only thing you have.
Yeah. Enjoy it now.
Enjoy it now. Or a kind of nihilistic, nothing matters anyway.
Yeah.
Because you're just a body, and a body is just this part of this machine that's unfolding. And Christianity resists both of those. It says, no, human person is body and soul. And it can't be, a person can't be less than either of those. So your body matters. My body matters. Our flesh is good. Our sex is good. All of this is a good gift from God. And there's a lovely verse in the New Testament, in the book of 1 Timothy, that says everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected, provided it's received with thanksgiving. So everything about our bodies is good, and to be received with thanksgiving. That means it has value, dignity, importance. It matters what we do with our bodies.
Yeah, how we live.
Because they're given to us as a good gift. And therefore, sexual differentiation is a part of that good. It's a good thing that we're different, male and female. It's something that God's given us, as we discussed earlier. And I think that's why some parts of the Bible are negative about a deliberate confusion of the genders. So there's some parts of the Old Testament law that talk about this, and there's some parts of the New Testament letters. And they are very wrapped up with particular cultural expressions of gender. And there's not many of them, so I wouldn't want to build too much on this.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't surprise us that if this is true, that a human is a body-soul union, that sexual differentiation is good and it matters, it's a logical conclusion, therefore, that to be negative about a deliberate confusing and mixing up of that good sexual differentiation.
So you're saying then, because our male and femaleness is a gift from God, that it's important that we uphold those differences?
Yeah, perhaps one helpful way to see it is that the social construction of gender needs to be admitted and held, that in part our gender is socially constructed. But also, as you say, the differentiation between the sexes also needs to be admitted and held. And as Christians, we hold on to both of those things as being true. So in the identity story, we say who I am is defined by my psychology and by my mind, and we see how that flows down into the new approaches to gender. But it's important to point out that we can't do that if we believe that the body soul is a union and that a body and soul matters.
We kind of can't divorce, as you say, like our mind from our physical bodies. And
exactly. And I guess our critique of the identity story, a part of our critique is that it does that. It divorces our mind from our body and it prioritizes the one over the other in defining who we are. Whereas Christianity holds the two together and says that our body and our mind or soul are both important. We've got a quote here from John Milbank, who's one of the most important contemporary theologians, really. And he wrote this: "We should still consider irremediable psychic disparity with one's gender body to be a highly rare exception. And normatively, one should assume, with the sensus communis of all ages, that gender indeed follows upon biological sex. Otherwise, one is embracing a most bizarre dualism of mind and body, or soul and body." So, to translate some of that, irremediable psychic disparity, that's when we're talking about things like gender dysphoria, where there seems a disconnect between our gender identity and our body. So what Milbank's saying is we should take that to be the exception, not the norm.
Okay.
Because if we don't, then we embrace the dualism.
Right.
And therefore, we should assume with the communal sense of all ages that gender is connected to biological sex, which is what we've already gone through a little bit today.
But are we going to come back to those exceptions?
Yeah, gender dysphoria and intersex, we will return to those. Before we do though, just one more point on gender as a gift from God, which is really a look forward to part 4 of Unraveling. So if our sexed bodies are a gift from God, we need to flag at this point that is related to our understanding of sex and of marriage and of human sexuality.
Okay.
So our maleness and our femaleness is much more than just our reproductive systems. I hope that's being clear.
Yeah.
But it's not less than that. And as we saw in those verses from Genesis, he made them male and female and blessed them and said, "Be fruitful," which relates then into issues of sex and marriage and sexuality. The one flesh union that we'll explore more in part 4 is tied to sexual differentiation that's considered to be stable.
Okay.
So all these issues do connect, and all things that God gives us are good. So again, just to affirm at this point that not only are our sexed bodies therefore good and a gift and to be welcomed, but our sexuality in all its dimensions, our desires, our bodies, our minds, or all parts of this are good and to be welcomed. But we'll dive up much more into that in part 4 of Unraveling. Yeah, but I wanted to flag it now because the two are connected.
Great. So I think we've covered then that we can see that gender is something that God created, as you said, and it's good, and we've unpacked a lot of what that means. But I think what does come out is that if everything isn't as neat and tidy quite as how you've put it, in reality, it doesn't always, it doesn't work out always as neat and tidy as that.
Yeah.
Like you said, we talked about, the exceptions really.
Yeah.
What about intersex?
Yeah.
What about when people have got gender dysphoria?
Yeah.
What about when being a man or being a woman causes pain or harm? And, what do we do about all of that?
Yeah, and so that's a really helpful way, I think, Liz, to move us on to our next major point. So we've talked about gender as being a gift from God, but now we need to talk about gender in a fallen world.
Okay.
So whenever as Christians we're looking at any part of our experience of life, we need to be asking, what of this is to do with God's created intention the way he wants it to be? And what if this is being defaced by sin and the fall? And really, there's always going to be a mix of the two. There's never going to be black and white, but it's going to be in this messy situation. How do we work out what is true about God's created intent and what is a consequence of sin? And we need to be careful actually that we don't make quick assumptions in either of those directions that, this is the way God meant it to be, or this is a result of sin. We need to be a bit careful working these things out. That's right, yeah. But we expect this to be true of our experience of our sex bodies and our experience of gender as well. We expect that our being male and female, being men and women, is going to be scarred by the effects of sin and living in a fallen world.
Can you give us some examples of how this plays out for us?
Yeah, I think we can look at how it plays out individually, but also corporately. So corporately, humanity as a whole, we might want to think of the way that one sex oppresses another. Okay. And historically, normally, that has been men oppressing women. So one good account of this is a book by Elaine Storkey, who's a Christian feminist philosopher, thinker, called Scars Across Humanity. And she just documents the horrific amount of violence that women have suffered at the hands of men in all times and all places, really. And it's a particularly painful example of how sin has defaced our experience of our sex bodies. We talked about men and women as being of equal value and interdependent.
Yeah, different but equal.
But what has often played out has been the oppression of women by men, sometimes in really violent ways. So that's one example. Another different example would be the harmful stereotypes around gender that have emerged in the past, that are still here in the present. Say, in our generation, a very common one that people will talk about is toxic masculinity.
Yeah, we hear that.
This idea that there's certain ways that we conceive of being a man that are actually really harmful to men and to women. Boys don't cry, all of this sort of stuff. But any of those sort of harmful social stereotypes are, again, ways that sin has come in and defaced our experience of being gendered, of being sexed people. And I think that some of the fuel behind the new approaches to gender is a recognition of these realities.
Okay.
That there has been oppression, that there has been corporate expressed sin and suffering. And some of that derives via the power and oppression story, some of the new approaches to gender that are sensitive to this. But sin doesn't just work its way out corporally, it works its way out individually as well. We each as humans experience the effects of the fall differently. But for some people, they will experience the impacts of the fall in suffering around sex and gender, where things aren't as they should be.
Okay.
And we would include in this disorders of sexual development, DSD, intersex, that we explored, and things like gender dysphoria, where this is not in line with the way God created humanity to be. Something's gone wrong. It brings suffering on an individual level for those who experience it. And there's loads of suffering individually related to sex as well, not just our sex bodies, but to sex, which we'll talk about more in part 4 of Unraveling. Having said that, there's some really important things to say.
Okay.
So what we're not saying is that individuals who suffer with gender dysphoria or an intersex condition of some sort are somehow more sinful or more fallen than any other human. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is we each are under the power of sin in a fallen world, and our experience of that are different. So although their suffering is connected to sin in general, it's not connected to their individual sin specifically. It's not that kind of straight line between the things we do. And
it's not a result of someone's personal sin.
Exactly. And it's really important to be clear about that in case that's when we talk about sin leading to suffering like this, that could be easily heard, but that's not what we're saying. And we're just saying that for them, that is part of the way that they're experiencing a fallen world.
Okay.
It's not they're particularly sinful.
Okay. So that's really helpful, and I understand that you're saying that this isn't about a person's personal sin, and some of those qualifications that you've given are really helpful. But isn't this, again, just being targeted, isn't this worldview being targeted at people who aren't cisgender? So if we're saying that our gender identity, when that isn't aligned with our sex, and that's a result of sin, does that not just make somebody feel ashamed and a lack of hope? How do we work that out?
I think that's a really important question, because it could be received that way, couldn't it? I can imagine, Tim, if you're saying that the experience is a result of the fall, the result of sin, then what you're really saying is there is something fundamentally wrong when our gender identity and our sex don't line up, or when something's gone wrong in our sexual development. This is something wrong, and therefore it just feels like a moral judgment.
Yeah, exactly.
Almost. That I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really important question. And so if we can maybe take a few minutes to say a bit more about that.
Yeah.
Because my conviction is that that's not what the Christian worldview is saying. And it actually offers a very different message. But I also recognise that the way that some Christians have talked about these issues absolutely comes across like that.
Yeah. And that caused some harm.
Yeah, and perhaps for some people has caused the conviction that the Christian worldview, such as we're articulating, is automatically going to have this outcome, of shaming or condemning people who don't fit into a gender binary very easily, all of that sort of thing. So, let's take a little bit of time to say a little bit more about that then, and hopefully cast a different way forward.
Yep.
I think the starting point is to say, if we really understand that statement that we're all under sin, all in a fallen world, then the metaphor I'd like to use is we're all on the same boat.
Okay.
We may have different individual experiences. It may play out differently in each of our lives, but no one's throwing stones because we're all on the same boat together. We could all go down with the ship, or not in that sense. And I think there's sort of concern sometimes with the Christian worldview that I've expressed, and some of the pushback that you're vocalising to me often normally comes from a place of compassion, doesn't it? That we see people suffering, and we don't want them to suffer, and we don't want to add to their suffering. We want to relieve their suffering. And then the suggestion can be that we should pull back from the kind of worldview that I've expressed. But what we have to see is there's no hope in that direction, that denying the truth never ultimately leads to freedom. If God has created sex and sexed bodies for the purpose of human flourishing, then to deny those realities about the way that God's created, or to deny that truth, cuts off the possibility of human flourishing, which doesn't relieve anyone's suffering, including those who are suffering with gender dysphoria or intersex conditions or that sort of thing. So we don't want to hold the boat that we're sailing on out of compassion. I think that the Christian worldview offers a better way forward than trying to deny any of that. So if sin has disfigured God's good creation, including our experience of our sex bodies and gender, then I think it offers three things in particular to those who struggle in this area. The first thing it does is it makes sense of our experience. It makes sense of the fact that we do suffer. That we talked about particularly rare examples as well, but even the common examples of the suffering of sometimes being a woman when that's not great. Or when being a man's not great, or when you have particularly difficult personal battles around gender. There's that sense of it shouldn't be like this. This is painful. This is wrong. This is suffering. I don't want to be experiencing life like this. It feels like it shouldn't have been this way. And the Christian worldview says,
that we all feel like
it shouldn't have been this way. Something has gone wrong. You weren't made to live in this kind of suffering and distress and confusion and all the rest of it. And this is, so one of my friends talks about the message of sin is actually a good news message, because it affirms to us that our instinct that something is wrong is correct.
The experience we're having, it is a sense of suffering, and it affirms that.
It affirms that. It in a sense, it vindicates it and gives it value. Like, it is bad. and we recognise that it's not meaningless.
Yeah.
It's bad and it matters. And the second thing then is it actually, contrary to sometimes how Christianity can be perceived, this actually offers massive acceptance for anyone struggling with the issues of sex bodies, gender, because we're all in the same boat.
Yeah.
Like, you might have pain and suffering and struggle in that area that I don't. But like I say, there's no stones going to be thrown.
Yeah.
Because I also live in a fallen world that has ways it plays out in my life. So actually we can offer one another compassion.
Yeah.
That we
all suffer.
We are in the boat together in different ways, and we can have a union around that in our common human condition that we can make sense of. And then the third thing that the Christian worldview offers is it says that there is actually hope for the future. Because you are created by God, any of the impact of the fall on your sense of identity, on your gender, on your sex, that doesn't define you most fundamentally.
Okay.
It might be very real, but because it doesn't fundamentally define you, it's not the most important thing about your experience in your life. Your value is protected, your dignity is protected because it's been given to you by God. Then actually we can face the truth. We can face the reality of our suffering and say, yeah, this is the case for me.
Yeah.
We don't have to fear it or avoid it or let it fully define us and our reality, because our identity is grounded in something beyond that, and there's a hope for the future.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that. So you've said there's this gives us a hope for the future.
Yeah.
So what is this hope that Christianity offers?
So to talk about the hope that the Christian worldview offers, we need to talk a little bit about the resurrection of Jesus.
Okay.
So two of the most outrageous and controversial but central Christian beliefs are the beliefs in the incarnation, that God became a human being in the person of Jesus, and the belief in the resurrection, that this man Jesus actually died and was properly dead.
Yeah.
And then was actually raised back to life by the power of God, and lived again in an embodied, resurrected form. So not as a soul somewhere,
a spirit somewhere,
but as an embodied person.
Okay. And we're not going to get into explaining it or defending this, are we?
No, there's no full theology of incarnation and resurrection coming out. You can be reassured about that. But we do need to flag it.
Yep.
And particularly the resurrection, because only through our belief in the resurrection do we make sense of a Christian hope. It's all tied to this belief. And that's what I want to get into, really.
Okay.
Because the resurrection of Jesus frames all Christian beliefs, including those around sex and gender. So we've got a couple of Bible verses that get us into this, if that's all right. So we'll read those three together. And what we'll see in these verses is that the resurrection of Jesus does two things that are important tonight. First of all, it vindicates material embodied creation as a good thing. So we read earlier about our bodies being good, and our sex bodies being good, and the resurrection vindicates this, that when God saves us in its most full sense, he doesn't get rid of material physical creation. He doesn't get rid of our embodiedness. It's restored. Okay. And it endures. Yeah. And so this then, secondly, reaffirms God's original created purposes. So he made humans to be a certain way. Mm-hmm. He made us to flourish and bless us, and for us to have a certain kind of life, to be all he's created us to be. And then sin comes in and defaces it all and causes all kinds of problems. But in the resurrection, God reaffirms his original purposes in creation. He doesn't say, well, because of sin, we'll scrap that and move on to something else. Yeah. He reaffirms that. And those two things are crucial for when we think about our hope. But we'll hopefully see those in these two bits of the Bible. So this one's taken from the letter of Romans in the New Testament, where we read Paul saying this: I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay. So I'm going to pause there.
Okay.
So this is the idea. Creation has been subjected to futility. It's suffering under now the power of sin.
Yeah.
It's not how it was meant to be. It's in bondage to decay. But it waits with eager longing for, and so picking up the verse now, it will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So interestingly, the redemption and salvation of humanity, human flourishing, is linked to the flourishing of all creation. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labour pains until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies.
Right.
For in this hope we were saved. So I know there's a lot there that we're not going to comment on, but that is key at the end. That what is the hope for which God has saved us? What is it we look forward to? What is it we groan in our suffering for? Your soul to leave your body and fly off to a happy paradise, heaven on the... No,
it's saying our bodies.
the redemption of your body. Which is such a strong statement of our hope in God restoring the whole person, body and soul. And Paul writes about this more in another letter to the Corinthian church. And we're sort of taking it in the middle of an argument. So again, some things will be less relevant to us, but in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead. Jesus has been resurrected, the first fruits of those who have died. And then he talks about the fall. Since death came through a human being, the story of Adam and Eve, they sinned, sin and death come into the world. The resurrection of the dead has also come from a human being. So we all die in Adam, we're all under the power of sin, but we will all be made alive in Christ. But in its order, Christ the first fruits, and then is coming those who belong to Christ. And then comes the end where Jesus hands over the kingdom to God the Father, destroys all ruler, every authority, every power, all sin, all oppression is destroyed, got rid of, the suffering's gone. And Jesus reigns until all of these enemies have been put under his feet. That's the metaphor that Paul uses. And the last enemy to be destroyed is death. But we see here again that when he's talking about the Christian hope, what do we hope for in the future? It's the resurrection from the dead of your human,
of our body.
embodied thing, And so kind of applying all of that then, so we've seen how that vindicates material creation as good and it reaffirms the purpose of creation, but it particularly affirms and vindicates our bodies.
Yes.
And what these bits of the Bible and the rest of the Bible as a whole shows us is that in the resurrection, our bodies will have continuity with our bodies now. There will be continuity in the life we experience then with the life we experience now, but there'll also be difference. And looking at the resurrected Jesus gives us some indication of where the continuities are and where the differences are. So for the purpose of what we're talking about this evening, one important continuity is that our bodies and our sexed bodies have continuity into the resurrection. Jesus was resurrected as a man. We will be resurrected as men and women, not as a genderless, sexless humanity. So there's continuity in that. But there's difference, there's transformation in that all suffering and all of the disfigurement of living in a fallen world will be gone and will be destroyed. And that shapes the Christian hope. There you go. So I've popped on the slide. Our future will be an embodied future, but our future will also be without the effects of the fall. So in terms of our hope then, ultimately our hope is that all suffering and all pain related to our sex and our gender will be healed and will be restored. And when we come to follow Jesus, when we give our life to him, when we become Christians, if you like, we secure that promise that one day all things will be made right. And And so that's our kind of ultimate hope. In the resurrection, all of this will be resolved.
Yeah.
But we also have hope in the present as Christians.
Okay.
All suffering and pain related to our sex and gender can be redeemed and healed. It will be fully in the resurrection, but it can in part be redeemed and healed now, but only in parts.
Okay.
And perhaps we can dig into that a little bit more in terms of what that might look like. So I think what that means is that, for example, when we become Christians, God comes to live within us.
Yeah.
We talk about another doctrine here, the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, that the Holy Spirit comes to live within us and allows us to experience the love and the acceptance and the grace of God. This is a visceral,
it's an experience,
felt, transformational experience of God's love for us, which can be part of the way that our suffering is redeemed and healed and our needs are kind of met in part now.
Yeah.
And this can change us. And so part of what we believe because of our hope in the resurrection is that we can be open to change now. That maybe my experience now and my suffering now isn't necessarily going to be this way forever, even in this life. Jesus can intervene. He can bring change. I can change. Things can... We talk about this sometimes as a process of growth in the Christian life, and some of that growth is out of some forms of suffering into freedom.
Yeah.
We experience something of that freedom now. But we don't need it to happen now.
Yeah.
And that's as important to say, because our future hope is secure.
Yeah. We know that's going to come.
It's going to come one day. So actually, if my suffering isn't fully relieved now, that is okay. It's not okay.
Yeah, we still suffer, but
it is okay.
We know that there will be an end to that suffering.
Yeah, and I don't need the change now if it will be secure in the resurrection. So that's the tension we hold as Christians, that we're open to change without needing it. And the consequence of that, really important in this debate, is that therefore we can resist harmful solutions. And I put solutions in quote marks because they're not real solutions, but they're often presented to us as solutions for our struggles with sex and gender. So to take one example of that, there are some really harmful approaches to this which come under the banner of conversion therapies.
Yeah.
So the idea that somebody has to change some of their inner experience and the way they feel, they kind of have to convert out of that and be different in order to end their suffering or in order to conform with whatever, whether that's a Christian worldview or something else. And actually a true Christian worldview says, no. None of this has to be the case at all. We can accept change, but we don't need it.
Okay.
And those sort of those forms of conversion therapy that seem to offer a solution to some, we can resist all of that and say, no, we don't need to go there. Conversion therapy is obviously a really controversial term that I've just used.
Yeah.
So I do also want to say that there's lots of other things that are sometimes lumped in as conversion therapy that are nothing of the sort. So even secular psychiatrists who want to work with people who have gender dysphoria and are open to them experiencing change might be branded by some as conversion therapy. So what I'm not talking about is a really wide definition of that term. But I'm talking about, I think, the versions of it that pretty much everyone agrees, this is a harmful thing, really. So there's those, but also some of the new approaches to gender promote reductionistic, simplistic solution. And we explored that a lot in the last video.
Yeah.
And having the hope that the Christian worldview offers also means we can resist those.
Yeah.
Like we don't need those approaches to fix everything right here, right now. And we can be more cautious and perhaps more critical and take a step back from some of that. And like we said last time, not here to particularly arbitrate a particular evaluation of the things we talked about last time.
Yep.
But what I want to say is we're not pushed into needing those solutions.
Yes, we don't need to rush into agreeing or...
because our future hope's secure.
Yes. Yeah.
So we don't need to sort it all now.
Yeah.
Because one day God will sort us out completely.
Yeah.
In His love.
So then, what are we saying about the kind of choices that we talked about on the last video? Like, I suppose, I mean, what does this mean for someone who may be suffering or struggling with gender dysphoria, but wants to follow Jesus?
Yeah, where does all this land in the end for someone like that? And so that is the sort of thing we're going to talk about on the next video.
Okay.
So most of what we have to say, we'll explore then. But I think there are a few things that's important to say now. First of all, there can be this assumption that we have. When I talked about when we come to know Jesus, God drawing close and coming into our lives, we can have the assumption that the things that He's least keen to draw near to are our struggles.
Okay.
And maybe particularly our struggles around sex or around gender, or
because there might be a sense of shame in some of that, culturally or in the church,
or history, or the assumptions that we have that somehow God's going to be distant from those things. But that's not true about who God is. The truth is that God draws most close to us in the areas of our struggles and in the areas of our pain and in our brokenness, very much including those around sex and gender and sexuality. My expectation would be that that is one of the places where God will want to draw closest to those who kind of open themselves up to Him, not that He'll want to keep their distance from that. And actually that allows us to perhaps be able to let go of sense of shame. Because God's love can be experienced in those places.
We invite Him into that.
I think that's where He wants to meet you. That's where He wants to meet all of us, is in our brokenness, because He wants to redeem and save and heal. So I think it's just worth saying that. And another thing that's important to say is there's rarely, very rarely, a sort of one-size-fits-all, here's how to deal with this in the Christian life. If you want to follow Jesus and you struggle with X, there's very rarely a, here's your pat answer, because we're all so different and the circumstances of our lives are so different. But what will always be the case is the way of hope, and the path of following Jesus will always be towards the truth. And that is the truth of how God has created us and the world. His created intent, what's true about that. It will always involve facing the truth about our fallen condition and the reality of where we are and what's going on, and the truth about how He calls us to live for flourishing and hope for the future. So however we find our way forward, it will always be a pursuit of the truth, because Jesus said it's the truth that sets you free.
I think that just made me think of when you spoke earlier about how we often feel that there's something wrong. There's something wrong with with ourselves, in the world. There's something wrong. But actually, like you say, as we walk with Jesus, he brings us to that sense of, oh, this is what the truth is. This is what is right. And we're more aligned with His original purposes.
That's right. An ever increasing journey now of healing and hope and growth, but looking forward to a future where all these things will be made right.
Great. And before we finish then, what does this mean for those of us who aren't personally struggling with these issues? What does this have to say for us?
99% of us will struggle at some point with our maleness or our femaleness, won't we? But you're right, for many of us, it's not the intense sort of issues that we've often referenced on this video. And so again, we're going to talk more in the next video about how we respond. How, as Christians then, given our worldview, do we respond to what's going on in culture, and do we respond to people and individuals? For now, all I want to say is that we are called to love our neighbour. What does it mean to love? We did a little video on this in part 2 of Unravelling that some people watching this will have seen. where we talked there about love doesn't necessarily mean to agree with or to affirm someone else's beliefs or actions. It doesn't necessarily mean to accept whatever someone else says as the truth or anything like this. These are all pale versions of love. To love someone is to will the good of the other person and to be willing to sacrifice personally for their good. And good is not what you think is good or what I think is good. I don't define that. You don't define that. God defines that. So I will the good as defined by God, and I'm willing to sacrifice. And that's what we're called to do. And I'd like to read one last bit of the Bible actually to finish our evening together, because we're dealing with this issue of gender in the middle of a culture war, aren't we? It's often aggressive. It's often polemical. It's often reductionistic, often seeks to misrepresent the other side. And as Christians, we can get caught up into that. We can end up trying to respond out of anger, maybe that it's not the way we want it to be and it's not our will, and we can be angry about that or get riled up by what some other people say and get into a fight. And if we're honest, it can also be out of fear that our worldview is perhaps feels under threat, or we just don't know what to do with the complexity of the issues, and we don't know where things are going to go, and there's a fear in us, and all of this can drive us to engage in the culture war in a really unhelpful way. So I want to finish by reading a bit about what the Bible has to say about love, that we are called in this culture war on this issue to love our neighbour. And this is taken from 1 Corinthians. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and have all knowledge, I know all the right things. And if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, I know all the right Christian things as well. But I do not have love, then I'm nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And that's our call as Christians, is to walk in this way, in this issue, and in every other part of our lives.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece of scripture to end our discussion on tonight. But I did want to just mention that I think everything we've talked about this evening, it can actually be really difficult for people to maybe going through some of this, or it can be very emotive for people. It's quite a difficult topic.
Yeah, it might have raised all sorts of things, mightn't it? Like you say, if we are experiencing some of this and in it ourselves, or if we know people who do and have friends and family who this issue affects, it might have thrown up all sorts within us, and we're under no illusion that we've somehow resolved all of that in this video. We know we haven't, and hopefully that's why the next video is important as well, where we'll have more time to look at how do we respond then, both in terms of where this lands in our lives as Christians responding to culture, but also where this lands in walking with individuals, and if we are the people who are affected, what do we do about all the stuff we've talked about? So hopefully the next video will cover at least some of that.
Great. That's it for tonight and for this video. But we did want to mention that if any of the content in today's video has caused you any distress, or if there's something that you want to discuss further with us, we really would invite that. Please contact us via our website if that is something you would like to do. In our next video of Unravelling, we are going to be spending our time exploring how this affects our day-to-day lives and how we live this out as Christians. So please join us then and contact us for more information at amblecodecc.org.uk/unravelling. See you next time.